So today we'll be taking a look at the 1930s with the rise of fascism and totalitarianism in Europe and abroad. We will also be looking at the beginning phase of World War II. Now, at the end of World War I, many of the overarching political and social problems that plagued Europe were not actually solved, so it's no surprise that extreme discontentment and anger erupted immediately after the Paris Peace Conference. One such nation where this was true was Italy, where the conference had given land promised to Italy by the Allies earlier in the war to newly formed nation of Yugoslavia. Now, also, you have the post war economy, which was terrible, extremely disastrous. It was in other places such as Germany as well, but it was like this as well in Italy. Now, the demobilization of the soldiers caused massive unemployment, and a lot of the land that was promised to these soldiers did not get delivered. Now, the result of all of this, all this extreme anger, was the proliferation of the socialist workers' movements, which of course frightens the Italian governments, the status quo governments, the powers that be. They feared these as radical leftist forces. Now, the state, in turn, turned to the fascists under Benito Mussolini, a former journalist and socialist whose black shirts militia absolutely menaced the leftists of Italy. We are essentially talking about thug violence, street violence. Now, the Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti disliked both of these political extremes, yet he feared the Marxists much more. So, the plan was to graft Benito Mussolini into the House of Deputies, it's sort of like their parliament, in hopes that it would convert him into this sort of status quo moderate politician, cutting him off from his radical roots. This, of course, would fail. Now, as this happens, the conservatives, these status quo statesmen who are working for the Kingdom of Italy, they begin to lose seats to the Communist Party under their leader Antonio Gramsci, who was a Sardinian Marxist thinker. Now, the fascists eventually also formed their own party in 1921, known as the PNF. Now, Mussolini's men, referred to as the Black Shirts, eventually make their big move and end up marching on Rome in 1922. And, of course, King Victor Emmanuel III makes Mussolini the prime minister to satiate him. Now, it needs to be understood that the Italian parliament worked with proportional representation. What this means is that if you get a certain portion of the votes, that's the portion of seats you get. It is different from, say, the House of Representatives here in the States. Well, this leads to a fragmented government. And what came to be was the Acerbo Law, which was set to change this, to unify the state, so that the winning party gets a majority of seats, a sort of winner-takes-all system. Now, in 1924, we see a clear right-wing coalition formed under Mussolini and a suppression of all the leftist deputies or House members. Now, on January the 3rd, 1925, Benito Mussolini entered the Chamber of Deputies, politically very strong at this point, and he dared anyone to remove him. They did not. What resulted was the formation of a dictatorship and suspension of civil liberties. So, as you have an extreme nationalist right-wing government in place. The king is still there. You still have parliamentary duties, but for all intents and purposes, Mussolini is the head of state and head of government as well. Now, you also have this propagandic vision with the Italian state of, this idea of rebuilding the old Roman glory, the old Roman Empire. And of course, we see attempts at reconstructing the economy, getting jobs, fixing the stagnation that Italy had faced after World War I. And of course, we see a political shift to where now, because it is a right-wing nationalist state, we see an alliance with Germany. Of course, because of this, they side with Germany's annexation of Czechoslovakia, and Germany, of course, in turn, would side with the Italian domination of Albania in 1939. Now, it should be noted that the fascist takeover of the state was not merely an act of force, where despots just seized the government. The rise of the fascists in both Germany and Italy shows a gradual ballot box takeover, by which the fascists are, they're grafted into the state. And naturally, the conservatives, the moderates, they tend to side with the fascists, because of a failure of the liberal order. Right after World War I, you have a parliamentary, conservative, central liberal state. They just couldn't really deal with a lot of the economic and structural problems Italy faced. And they especially were ineffective at dealing with the Marxist revolutionaries. The fascists would take a hard line against them. Now, when we get into the doctrine of the Italian fascists, we see this Western notion of equality that came out of the Enlightenment. It is viewed as unnatural in their system of social Darwinism, and of course, it is rejected. Hypernationalism is extremely present here. We have this fervor with emphasis on a state over the individual. In fact, Adolf Hitler and Nazi state theorists would build upon this theory. And of course, just like in Germany, intense hatred of Jewry, as a scapegoat for Italian structural problems is present. Now, Italian fascists really worked on this idea of corporatism, which is a modified capitalist model whereby big industrial powers and titans colluded with the state to control all labor and production. All workers' movements were deemed Marxist and were suppressed heavily. Now, the fascists were, of course, highly militant and imperialist. We shouldn't forget the effect World War One had on society. It had brutalized society and definitely influenced fascist thought. Now, as the 1920s lead into the 1930s and economic woes get much worse throughout many parts of Europe, fascism spreads. The ideas of Mussolini and later of Adolf Hitler begin to spread to other nations. Romania, we have the Iron Guard. In Hungary, we have the Arrow Cross. And in Belgium, we have the Rexist. And in Spain, of course, we have the group known as the Phalange. These are all ultranationalist right-wing groups, each with, slight changes between them, depending on culture and nation. Now, when the Great Depression really erupts after the stock market crash in 1929, we see this notion in fascist thought that the Great Depression had undermined the validity of Western capitalism and liberal democracy. It seems that this moderate parliamentary liberal order was just incapable of defeating the Marxist threat or fixing the economic woes brought about by the collapse of the market. Fascism was deemed as the only way forward. One area where we see this take place is in Spain, where we see Spain's Second Republic wage a horrific civil war against the fascists and the leftists. Most notably, this group, the Phalange or the Phalangists, they fought with the army, that is the rebellious army under Francisco Franco, against the state. And in Spain, much like other places in Europe, the left was just too divided to function as a single unit to defeat the right. The left was made up of liberals, Marxists, socialists, and anarchists, and they all hated each other quite a bit. The left was breaking apart at a time where the right was coalescing. So Francisco Franco did end up winning the Civil War and forming a fascist state in Spain. So we will now be looking at the state of affairs in Japan going into the 1920s and 1930s before the outbreak of the Second World War. Now, one thing that was really formative for Japan in this period was the Washington Naval Conference of 1921. This treatise limited Japan's navy relatively more so to other powers' limitations. The League of Nations also rejected Japan's racial equality clause that was proposed. So we're starting to see that despite being technically a victor from World War I, Japan actually feels quite excluded from the Western liberal order. This will be important for the events that develop later. Now, the Japanese parliament, or the Diet, has expanded in these interwar years, giving all adult males the right to vote. Now, you do have these factions in the state. One was we have the traditionalists, who they fear modern Western ideas, and of course the stock market crash, these nationalist factions gained massive traction, just like in Europe. Now, the young emperor, Hirohito, was quite disinterested in politics compared to, the statesmen that be in the Diet, so this void is filled by the ambitious factions. The divide between the moderate traditionalist and the more militarist, right-wing groups, such as the Black Dragon Society, also existed at this time. We also see the rise of Showa Statism. We see this leads to the abolition of the Diet, functional suspension of the Meiji Constitution for a right-wing nationalist state, a militant state, of course, with disdain for Western interlopers and ideas. And a lot of this philosophy is based off the ideas of the Japanese philosopher Ikikita. Now, amidst this period of rapid industrialization, Japan, a nation of relatively low natural resources, needs to look outwards in a way to build their empire. They need resources from an external source, and they can't just get it through trade because that's dependency on foreign nations. So, of course, there is an army plot to invade the Manchuria region of China, which the Japanese refer to as Manchukuo. And of course, they had opportunity to because the Chinese Civil War between the Marxists under Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists, not to mention the presence of extreme warlordism and decentralization, had destabilized China. It was primed to be invaded. Now, at this time, you also have two generals of the Kwantung Army, that is the Japanese army in China, Kanji Ishiwara and Itagaki Seichiro, and they invade without the Diet's permission in 1931. And later on, we see the bombing of Shanghai in 1932. Hirohito's cabinet was largely split over this, yet the Diet was largely powerless to halt it. And of course, the army was basing their ideas off the Japanese concept of keikokuo. It's this doctrine cited as its rationale, the idea of principled insubordination against higher ups, the higher ups for the greater good of the Japanese people. And, the Japanese start to see a lot of successes in China. They are beginning to conquer land and harvest its resources. And in this era of, imperialism, a government that is definitely shifting to the right, many liberals are even convinced to leave the League of Nations as nationalists gain ascendancy. And of course, up here we see these Japanese people. They're packing their stuff and leaving. The League of Nations, the League of Nations Japanese staff are just taking off. They don't need it because, mind you, Japanese feel alienated by the Western order. This is not surprising. Now, as the Meiji state weakens, we see that the army begins to take a very large presence in government. But you did have two philosophies or two ways by which the army did this. One such way was the imperial way. These were the ultra nationalists. They engaged in heavily reactionary politics. They did do limited social welfare programs, and this essentially resembles European fascism. It's sort of like an analog of European fascism. Then you, of course, you have the control faction. It's not, you still have moderates around. These are the moderates that rejected socialism and fascism. They're traditionalists. However, both of these groups agreed on one thing: ending democracy of the Diet. They are not, again, they consider it a Western liberal order idea. The Japanese feel alienated, so though these two ways disagree with one another, they both would like to essentially take control over the Diet for themselves. Now, Prime Minister Inokai Tsuyoshi was assassinated by naval officers in 1932 due to his largely anti-military stance. This discredited the implicated Imperial Wave faction, alongside their February 26 coup, which it flopped entirely. It did not work. Yet, in all of this chaos, Emperor Hirohito allows the army to select the next Minister of War, who in turn would choose the cabinet. This means that the army now has the power to veto legislation and essentially control the entirety of the state. The two factions of army in this period were essentially conjoined over time, and in 1940, Hideki Tojo was the Minister of War. Around this time, the right-wing nationalist state formed their own police force, a secret police known as the Kempeitai. Now I will just speak to an extent about Hideki Tojo, the Minister of War and eventually the Prime Minister of Japan. He was an Imperial Japanese officer who rose through the ranks. He had very militarist ideas, and he was a stern supporter of the Emperor and the army. He was the chief of staff of the Japanese Kwantung Army in 1937, and Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe selects him as the war minister in 1940. Tojo was largely responsible for expanding the Sino-Chinese, the Sino-Japanese War, and he begins to enter this sort of political struggle with Konoe as they had very different ideas. Konoe was certainly, less. He was more to the left than Tojo was, and he was even, thinking about peace talks, but ending the war in China. He was more of your control faction figure. Now, Tojo would eventually take his place in 1941, and Tojo was responsible for upholding the tripartite pact with Hitler and Mussolini. So it's clear with Tojo and Mussolini that there is a clear alliance with Adolf Hitler. We have a clear, international political alliance of right-wing forces. Now, while the control faction was actually in peace talks with China to come to some sort of settlement, the Japanese Kwantung Army of their own volition invaded in 1937, launching the Second Sino-Japanese War. Now, this forced the Chinese Marxists under Mao and the nationalists to unite briefly to face this new Japanese threat. The government of Japan would declare, war in support of the Kwantung Army's invasion. So we see this is a common thread. The Japanese government is fairly divided due to factionalism, and the right-wing people eventually, take the side of the army's independent decisions. Now, around this time, we see this cultural shift in Japan where the Bushido Code essentially morphs into this vicious social Darwinist model, whereby the Chinese were to be completely destroyed, and the Japanese viewed them, as chankoro, as vermin. And of course, the vicious rape of Nanking saw 6 weeks of horrific atrocities committed against the Chinese people. Rape, murder, pillaging, bayoneting, beheadings, and even competitions to see who could kill the most Chinese. It was the Chinese were completely dehumanized in the Showa Statist model of social Darwinism. And all this slaughter, by the way, was encouraged from the top down. This was not something just done by rampaging armies of their own volition. The officers at the very top supported this. And of course, in China, we see a vicious, horrific cycle of reprisal violence. When the Japanese invade, you have angered peasants who join up with the Marxists. These Marxist groups would begin raiding, which in turn would cause the Japanese to, cause these reprisal killings, usually against unarmed civilians, which foments, of course, a cycle of further angry peasants that join up with the Marxists and so forth. So we see in China horrific, horrific violence that goes on for many years. Now, one of the more famous examples of the atrocities the Japanese committed against the Chinese was the military unit 731, which was a military research outfit being used to conduct biological tests and pathogen research using the Chinese people and prisoners as human guinea pigs. We see rampant examples of vivisections infecting wells with the bacteria that cause typhoid fever, what they call bubonic flea bombs, the spreading of cholera and anthrax, all sorts of biological agents. They subjected the civilians to weapons and toxin testing. They placed people in low pressure chambers until their eyes popped. We have forced dehydration, burnings, and X ray exposure. Just really horrific stuff. So, as a recap of the Japanese foreign policy in this period, the expulsion of the Russians in the Russo Japanese War and the Chinese Qing dynasty's dissolution allowed the Japanese Kwantung Army to devour China. That's essentially the state of Japanese foreign policy at this point. Now, in this period, that is the Showa period, we see that there is a new philosophy afoot amidst this right wing, Showa statism period, and that is that we have Confucian categories fusing with social Darwinism. Now, in this model, we see that Japan replaces China as the head of Confucian family of nations. Other Asians, of course, were inferior to Japan as per social Darwinist, race hierarchy theory, and Japan stands as the hegemon of this proposed Pan-Asian sphere. And as I said earlier, Bushido transforms into this, nationalist atrocity. Now, it needs to be said that a fundamental Japanese belief in the Showa state was this, belief in the self-humanity of all the Chinese in particular. All soldiers of theirs, they were just, Chinese soldiers were deemed to be bandits. You could just shoot them, treat them like trash. And civilians, of course, were nothing more than rebels that were pretending not to be. They were just in hiding. And then further you have these Japanese claims of, the Chinese don't have any real cultural cohesion, and all these things serve as the justification for Japanese civilizing efforts, that is, imperialism. Around this period, especially in Nanking, we see extreme group rape and collective violence, which is learned from young men watching others and from officers above them. And, it needs to be said that there is really no accountability for the atrocities against the Chinese, and why would there? Why would there be? The Japanese considered them chankoro or vermin. Now, few places in Europe were as devastated by the post-World War I state of affairs as Germany. Now, at the end of World War I, the Germans had destroyed the Russians, utterly defeated the Tsarist forces. And the war ends with the German troops deep in France. And around this time, we have state propaganda, claiming that the war was nearly won. So, when Germany didn't win, we have this backstab myth, right, where Germany was sabotaged on the home front by Jewry, Democrats, and socialists. All this extreme anger really sullies the newly formed Weimar Republic's reputation. Now, the Social Democratic Party, of the Weimar Republic, very, very unpopular amidst, especially in the 1930s. We have staggering inflation, horrific unemployment, and of course, the Versailles humiliation of the Versailles Treaty really infuriates and shocks the German people. So, much like in Italy, we have leftist socialist movements such as the Socialist Spartacist Revolt, and much like in Italy, the government relied on rightist paramilitaries such as the Free Corps to survive. Now, the man who would come to define rightism and fascism in Germany was an Austrian born German drifter named Adolf Hitler, who found purpose fighting for Germany back in World War I. He was, of course, infuriated by Germany's defeat and humiliation at the Paris Peace Conference and Treaty of Versailles. Now, the government afterwards would use him as a spy to watch over radical political groups that were outcasted from the Weimar Republic's political system. Yet Hitler was convinced to join with one such group, which, after some restructuring, became known as the National Socialist Party, or the Nazis. His anti-Semitism, demagoguery, and extreme anti-democratic rhetoric, and of course his brilliant speechcraft would come to define him. Now, his big moment early on was the Beer Hall Putsch, which was a failed march on Berlin back in 1924. Hitler was jailed, yet he served less than a year due to sympathetic, pro-Nazi judges. Hitler was to use institutions to kill off democracy, just as Benito Mussolini did. And of course, the population was wary of the Weimar state, due to high unemployment, extreme inflation, extreme structural problems. They were ready for change, even if it was to come through extreme right wing statesmen. Now, the Nazis had this Sturmabteilung, or the SA, as their militant wing of the party. These guys engaged in a lot of, constant street violence, assassination tactics, car bombings, shootings, stabbings, anything they could to counter their adversaries, particularly, left-wing adversaries. Now, Hitler, as time passed, as the Nazis became more popular, you know, Hitler really finds himself at the head of the largest party in the Reichstag. Now, usually this means that this should make him prime minister. Yet President von Hindenburg really hated Hitler, really hated him. And of course, he would use Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution to suspend the Reichstag in case of emergencies. His political ally, Franz von Papen, he eventually schemes to, to place Hitler as the chancellor with himself as vice chancellor. This would, of course, in theory, would appease his need for power. They wanted to control Adolf Hitler and make him a puppet of the Weimar state. And this, of course, it occurs in 1933. Very famously, here's Hindenburg, here's Adolf Hitler on the left. And of course, around this period, Germany pulls out of the League of Nations. So we see these states that are influenced by rightist thought. They pull out of the League of Nations, as that is a symbol of the Western, post World War One liberal order. Now, the event that really catalyzed Hitler's formation of Germany into an autocracy from the Weimar Republic was the burning of the Reichstag Parliament building. Hitler declared an emergency state to be formed, and he suspends civil liberties, and he used the opportunity to blame and crush his Marxist leftist rivals. And of course, he would take this time to deputize his party thugs. Through the Enabling Act, he was to rule by fiat, and after Hindenburg's death, Hitler ends up abolishing the German presidency, and he takes the title of Fuhrer. The armed forces were forced to swear loyalty to Hitler personally. Now, Nazi policy is centered on this ideological notion of social Darwinism, much like Showa Statism and Italian fascism. The state is an expression of the race. Germans, of course, were the master race. They were to obtain Lebensraum, or living space land, mostly from Slavic lands to the east. All Slavs were to be expelled east, and to destroy the Jewish race and their international conspiracy to obliterate the German race via Bolshevism and liberal democracy. So much like in other fascist movements, the Jews were the scapegoat. And of course, we have this old nationalist goal of unification of all Germans. They were to engage in eugenics to purify the population. Now, the Germans operated also under this notion of Gleichschaltung, or total control over all groups, entities, organizations. Even the church in this period is manipulated as a part of the state apparatus. It is a total cultural and government upheaval. We will now be taking a look at various pieces of the Nazi state and various important personnel within it. First is Joseph Goebbels, who was the Minister of Propaganda, and he worked tirelessly to convert the population into full-blown Nazis, and of course, to use the media to suppress all contrary ideas. To this end, he was very, very successful. Next on the list is Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the Schutzstaffel, or the SS. Basically, it was this private elite guard, an auxiliary police force of the Nazi state. Another project put about by Himmler was the Gestapo, which was the secret police force of the state to root out dissent wherever they could find it. Himmler oversaw the state development of concentration camps and ghetto building when the Holocaust begins to get underway. Now, part of Nazi policy was industrial rearmament, deficit spending, mass construction efforts, and conscription into the army, and a foregoing of the Versailles settlement, which had put many limitations upon the German military and industrial state. This was central to Nazi state policy, undoing the horrors of the Versailles settlement. And by 1936, the Rhineland was rearmed and the Axis Pact was officially formed. And as a conclusion we can draw from all of this is that inaction from the League of Nations is really what emboldens Hitler to make these baby steps that leads to a stronger and more successful Nazi state. And Hitler now intends to unite all German enclaves separated by borders drawn at the end of World War I. Now, to this end, the first of Hitler's expansionist policies was pursuing the Anschluss, or the union with Austria, whose population largely, many members of the population largely liked Hitler, and which had many ethnic Germans within it and a similar culture. Austria really did contain many ethnic Germans, so it was a natural target for expansion. The Chancellor, Kurt von Schuschnigg, resigns. You have a military movement into Austria, but it is a bloodless takeover. There is a largely peaceful union with Austria. Hitler then would target the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia and its sizable German population. Now, at the Munich Conference of 1938, war is very narrowly avoided, and England and France wish to avoid war by appeasing Hitler. Now, if the English, Neville Chamberlain, and the French Edward Daladier believed that they could have, they really did believe they secured peace for their time by appeasing Hitler and giving him, these meager gains in hopes it would satiate him. Hitler presses the Slovak and Hungarian minorities to rise up against Czechoslovakia, and then, in turn, pressures the president of Czechoslovakia, Emil Hacha, into accepting German protection as a vassal state. Hitler essentially bullies the guy into forcing him to submit his state into being a German puppet. Emil Hacha, despised this, but he really had no other choice. He had been abandoned by his powerful Western allies. Now, Hitler then targeted, the free city of Danzig, yet he would need to invade the Polish corridor in order to obtain it. So it was clear that war was coming at this point. Hitler would form a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. He's trying to prevent another World War I disaster where Germany is caught up in battle on both fronts. And he forms a plan with Joseph Stalin to divide up Eastern Europe between the two powers. Hitler would eventually put into place Case White, or the plan to invade Poland. Now, when the Wehrmacht invades, they invade with 59 army divisions attacking from the north, west, and south in sweeping pincer movements. Soviets invade from the east in the meantime, and Warsaw is eventually surrounded. Despite putting up a brilliant fight, the Poles do end up losing. They're too divided, and the German tactics are too sophisticated for them. Now, the Germans operated under the military, philosophy of blitzkrieg, where Panzer and Luftwaffe combined arms tactics. It's really the brainchild of Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein, where you see these massive armed pushes to break holes in enemy lines, to which the next wave of infantry pour in to flank the Poles. They would do this the same strategy would be used against the French and English as well. And it should be noted that before the Holocaust was truly instituted, there were still war crimes very early on. The Luftwaffe was, often strafing refugee caravans. We see indiscriminate killings, violence, and rounding up of Jews by the Selbstschutz German ethnic forces in the region. These Germans in Poland that form communities to defend themselves against their Polish majority ethnic groups. Now, we also see Operation Tannenberg, the murder of the Polish intelligentsia and leadership during this assault into Poland. Himmler ends up deporting 500,000 of these Poles, to the east under the general government under Hans Frank. And Hans Frank's government in East Poland is really the testing ground for ethnic cleansing. This is where they're starting to test out ideas that would take place during the Holocaust. And, we have this goal by Heinrich Himmler to prevent race mixing. We see that this is an aspect of eugenics. We also have the Caton Forest massacre, where the Germans kill a ton of captured Pole officers, and the Soviets commit very similar atrocities in the east. Now, over the winter of 1939, we have what's sometimes called the Phony War, or the Sitzkrieg, due to the lull in action. Now, the French are relying largely on the Maginot Line, a long line of fortifications that run up and down the the Franco-German border. And, we have this French commander, Maurice Gamelin, who thinks essentially that World War I can be refought, and the Germans can be halted once again. Now, Hitler manages to preempt English plans for landings in Scandinavia by taking Denmark and Norway and placing a puppet, Vidbol Quisling, in power. And of course, he does this also to secure a Swedish iron ore. Germany, is much like Japan, is also in need of resources amidst this industrial war. Now, the invasion of France, which the Germans planned up as Case Yellow, what would come into be is, Case Yellow, the Manstein Plan. I would like to say that the Germans did have a previous plan that was more like the Schlieffen Plan from World War I, but Hitler eventually goes with Erich von Manstein's plan, where, France would be invaded with a diversion at the Maginot Line. And also up at Belgium, you'd have commando groups to land up in the Low Countries to distract the English and French forces to think they would attack through Belgium or through the Maginot Line, when in reality, these panzer groups would actually push through the Ardennes forest and cut off the Allies and would encircle them. This is a blitzkrieg tactic. Again, paratroopers would take key parts of the Low Country and would distract the English and French and allow bridgeheads to be taken for the armor groups to push through. Now, Manstein's Army Group A ends up smashing through the Ardennes, completely taking the French and English troops by surprise. And A and B would both encircle the Allies at the port city of Dunkirk, prompting a massive evacuation effort, which saved numerous French and English lives. Although the English and French were completely obliterated in France, the Axis clearly won the battle for France after the onset of Case Yellow. There was still French resistance elsewhere, but it was clear that from the expulsion of the English from the continent and 100,000 French casualties and extreme chaos in their officer corps, the French really had no choice, and the French cabinet surrenders to Germany. The Dutch capitulate after the bombing of the city of Rotterdam. Now, the English firebrand Winston Churchill refused to surrender. And because of this, as we get into August of 1940, we see the Battle of Britain, a very famous air war between the Luftwaffe and the RAF, the Royal Air Force. Now, the Battle of Britain begins, and it begins with German targeting of English defense systems, airfields, and so forth, and then on to bombing civilian targets, cities. The RAF managed to hold off Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe with huge losses, yet with radar and RAF strategic expertise, the Luftwaffe ends up failing the Battle of Britain. It is the first serious German defeat in World War II. The Germans lose 2,600 pilots, an enormous loss to their air force, one that is very, very difficult to regain. And finally, I would like to take a look at Hitler's rise in retrospect. And really, if we look at the big picture here, we see that Hitler's rise was really an enormous failure of the international order. Let's take a look at what left politics looked like. Well, you had the famous Soviet Marxist thinker and Soviet leader Leon Trotsky, who regarded fascism as human dust, and Joseph Stalin considered it to be capitalism's final stage. They looked at it very dismally. Communists slammed social democrats as social fascists. And of course, this shatters the unity of the left during a time when the right was growing in strength and coalescing. So the division of the left allowed the right to grow relatively much stronger. Now, around this time, Stalin was busy purging his own army. The French leader de Gaulle was largely politically inactive in halting any of Hitler's activities, and Churchill alone really stood as the only alarmist at Hitler's growing danger to European powers. So Europe really had no chance of putting up with Hitler. They had leaders who, other than Winston Churchill, weren't really all that concerned with defeating Hitler. After all, appeasement really, they believed that it had him subdued. It should be also, it also should be noted here that Italy and the Spanish Civil War distracts Europe from Hitler. You have these explosive actions with Benito Mussolini forming an autocracy in Italy, and the horrific Spanish Civil War with Francisco Franco as the main points of European foreign policy. Hitler seemed, in some aspects, to be an afterthought. Now, the Anschluss, or the union with Austria, ends up giving the Wehrmacht practical expertise with marching and operational efficiency. It also alleviated some of the Reich's financial situations due to Austrian foreign currency holdings, which the Germans would take advantage of. Now, the peaceful taking of the Czech armament complexes of Skoda and Brunn gave Hitler a large weaponry boost and extra arm plants. And of course, the main failure, without question, very famously, was the policy of appeasement, by which the French and English allowed the Reich to grow more, very, very powerful. Hitler would recount, actually, at the Munich conference, that Hitler had seen his enemies and that they were worms. So all of these foreign policy blunders really proved to Hitler that the English and French were, fairly weak. They were weak people. They were weak-minded. They had, a weak outlook on life, a weak foreign policy, and that Hitler, if this was his chance to, strike, he had to do it now, because he could see that his enemies, as he called them, were nothing but worms. And the next time, we will be taking a look at the continuation of the war in Europe and the further Japanese expansion in the Pacific.